how do you think coaches can start to dip their toe into building a second brain for creating content, maintaining client relationships, and generally just preserving their sanity?
Yeah, so this is actually something that I've been thinking about for a long time. So I want to talk a little bit about the psychology, what I think is the psychology of coaches and trainers around this subject, and then I'd be very curious to hear if you also see this. So, first of all, the reason that I care about this a lot is when I think back through my life, there were these people who I worked with that made such a huge difference for me. Such a huge difference for me, from sports coaches in school to personal trainers to yoga instructors to a CrossFit coach that I had for a time. And even broadening that category, I don't know if there's a name for this category, but massage therapists, acupuncturists, Reiki. I did Reiki one time. There's this whole category that includes coaches and trainers, but is broader, that are like people who have rare tacit knowledge, but that usually need to be with you in person in order to deliver that knowledge, right? They have to touch you, they have to look you in the eye, they have to see your body language, they have to have an interaction, a coaching, conversation. And so I'm really passionate about bringing the leverage of these digital tools to these people out of gratitude. But here's what I notice is these practitioners, we'll just call them practitioners, they usually work on an hourly basis, right? They have a lesson or a session or a appointment or whatever it's called. And they usually are charging a certain amount for that hour. And their whole goal is to get that hourly rate as high as possible, right? They're very fixated on that hourly rate. They want to make 100 and then 150 and then 200 and then 250. It's like a reputation thing. It's a self-respect thing. It's like they're really attached to this number. But then when I talk to these practitioners often, and you look at kind of the holistic picture of their finances, it's pretty bad. It's pretty
Yeah.
bad. A lot of coaches and trainers and practitioners are in really precarious financial situations that I talk to. Even ones that charge really high per hour. And the reason, I think, as we know, any of us who have billed hourly, is it's hard to fill your schedule, right? Like if you have a client in a day or two, that's not enough. You got to fill your time. You got to maximize your billable hours. And that's so hard to do as a solopreneur, right? Like when you don't have a whole marketing, like a doctor can do this because they have a whole appointment desk and they have a waiting room. They have this supply of people always ready to come in, but most of us can't afford that. And so I'm just fascinated by this problem of people who are almost stuck, addicted to this super high hourly rate, but that cannot build a good living, a sustainable living that allows them to have more free time and step away because it's so hard to fill the roster.
Yeah, and you frame this as a financial problem, but this is really a information management problem. The reason that I'm saying that, I'm sure you agree, is that, as you say, if you're charging hourly, even if it's a really premium service, even if you're a doctor in the States, for example, we don't have that luxury in the UK. Yes, there's always enough work, but we just get paid a crap salary regardless. But you have to just pedal harder to earn any more. There's no leverage in that. And this certainly goes for practitioners that I think do well in spite of the financial model that they're running. And I think there's an element of moralistic ego that some people have with this as well, that like, oh no, I have to work with someone one-on-one, I'm hands-on only. I couldn't bear to just give someone a cookie cutter template. But it's not one or the other. And there are very much blocks of information that every therapist, every yoga teacher, every coach has to just translate that block of information to a client. It's the kind of the beginner's foundations stuff, regardless of
Yeah,
who they are.
that's the thing.
And
That's the thing right
yeah,
there. Is like, here's a little quiz for your listeners. You know, how much of your time, think about the whole skill that you're trying to teach, whether it's ballroom dancing or whether it's, jump roping or like whatever the skill is for your clients. How much of the time are you spending teaching the bottom 70%? from absolute beginner up to a level of 70%, how much of your time are you spending teaching again and again and again, probably in exactly the same way, that bottom 70%? I'd say it's probably most of people's time, right? It's so problematic because you're not delivering the highest value to them. You can't charge more, right? Because you're just covering the basics. You're getting bored. You'll inevitably get bored of that. They'll get bored. So you can't, you have to keep adding to the value you're providing to clients, and you can't do that if you're just reteaching the basics again and again and again.
I would actually argue that it's worse to teach it ad hoc each time, because, and we've
Yeah.
done this in terms of, it's the core, the core model of what we advise people in terms of delivery of their coaching is to build up a gold standard explainer series that they give to all clients to get them up to speed. Because if
Yes.
you're doing it individually, or you're opening up a blank document and writing their plan each time and your client signs up, that document is totally at the mercy of what you can remember at the time, or how tired
Yes.
you are on a given day or whatever. So you're not delivering a standardized service.
Exactly. No, that's yet another reason to do it. And it's difficult because you're going to need to cannibalize a little bit. Like, yes, one of your clients may buy your $49 course or whatever, or your free blog post, instead of paying you $150 to have a 1 hour beginner session, right? And that's scary. I know how scary that is. It's like, am I just giving away this precious knowledge that's taken me 20 years to acquire? But if you don't cannibalize yourself, right? Like, you want to be the one to cannibalize yourself, not have someone else do it to you.
Yeah, someone's just going to Google it if they can't find it from you. So you may as well treat it as your lead magnet, and then what someone's going to see that and be like, whoa, okay, if that's just the introductory stuff, like imagine how far I could go working with this person. I started working with a psychotherapist recently, and I was really impressed that in the second or third session, she just sent me a PDF that was 30 pages long, and it explained the core model of what we'd be working through. And I was like, oh, brilliant. Like, I didn't, some people might feel fobbed off by that, but I would rather receive a gold standard quality bit of information that gives me a framework to that, so that, because there's no point in her, as you say, just rehashing the same stuff manually. And then it means you can get straight into the meat of stuff rather than going through the
Exactly.
basics.
Exactly. This is what I kept noticing with my productivity coaching, right? I was in San Francisco and I thought, oh, I'm going to do this super high hourly rate. But I would show up, at someone's office, sit down with them first hour, and they'd be like, okay, what do I do? And I'm just like, well, I mean, it was just starting at such a low level that we'd spend the whole first hour just kind of like puttering around and just like, oh, what productivity app do you use? Well, here's one you could use. Like, it was so low value. And I started to see this with my very first course, which was a very affordable, I think it was like $30 self-paced course, is the person who had done that course first, even just part of that course, they became my ideal client. Because now they have much more specific questions. Now they know how much they're lacking. Now they have follow-up, things they want to cover from the course. All the basics have been covered. And so it's almost like we're starting at hour 5 instead of starting at hour 1, which means I'm more engaged and interested, which means they're committed. Like how nice it is to have a committed client, right?
Oh,
How much better of an
yeah.
experience is that for you? It's like, oh yeah, someone who cares. The best way to make sure they're committed is to ask something of them on the front end, right? Like, almost think of it like an onboarding. Someone reaches out to you, they want to work with you. Instead of immediately saying yes, just be like, absolutely. I just have a short orientation, an onboarding, an initial module for you to go through, which can be 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. If they drop off the face of the planet when you ask that of them, you probably don't want them as a client anyway, because they're going to ghost you. You'd rather have them ghost you for the self-paced course or the free content than to be at the gym waiting for them and to have them not show up, right?
Yeah, it's a perfect filter for someone that you want to work with. So if someone's listening to this and being like, right, I'm fully sold on the idea of building an onboarding sequence or a welcome pack, how would you recommend someone goes about doing that if they have no second brain system to speak of?
Yeah, great question. So how does this start? How do you know what to create as your first thing? What you're really trying to do is start with just like the top, like the first 10 or 20% of what you always have to cover, right? And think even more basic than you think, right? Like if you're a tennis instructor, how to put on tennis shoes. If you're a ballroom dance instructor, how to, I don't know, like what kinds of clothes to buy. Like it could even be a step before they even arrive to do the thing that they're gonna do, right? Like you want to go kiteboarding, how to check I just did my first kiteboarding lesson yesterday. How to check the wind forecast to know whether you should even go to the beach. Like every single activity has these sort of preliminary steps that to you, like this is what makes it hard. To you, they are so automatic and so natural, you don't even realize you're doing them. They're like unconscious. And this is where notes come in. Okay, this is the very starting point is notes. You have to just really observe yourself. What are the first thoughts that enter your head as you start to begin doing that activity? Write those down in your phone. Use Apple Notes. Use the Android, default notes app. Right there, write them down. Record an audio memo. As you're getting ready to do whatever it is, just put into your phone, narrate to yourself. Okay, I'm about to go kiteboarding. Here's the checklist of things that I think about before I even head out to the beach. I think of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Record an audio memo. You can use a tool like Otter.ai, OTTER.ai, which transcribes what you just said into text, which can then be searched. You have to just capture. That's my word. So the term I use is capture those initial little things. And once you capture them, then you start to add layers. You start to add a little instructional video. You start to add sub-steps. You start to add a demonstration. You start to add photos. And you won't believe how basic that starting seed can be. Like the 5 steps to begin doing X, that can be a whole blog series or a whole video or a whole course that people will pay for. You will be amazed how basic of a thing people will find valuable when they're just getting started with something.
Yeah, that is a great way to start because, as you say, what is obvious to you is often mind-blowing to your audience. And there's often been stuff that I've thought, oh, it's not even worth recording a video about that. It's not even worth making content about that because it's so obvious. But actually, it's so commonly requested that you're like, oh, okay, let's see how I can package this. And often because it's so obvious to you, you have so many blind spots to what part of that is teachable. And so a couple of things to add, I guess. I do love Otter.ai, great tool for anyone who hasn't used it. But I guess if you're able to record a session with a client, if you have a new client, you say, look, do you mind if I just, for my own reference, just record the audio of the session? Some people might find it a bit weird, but if it's to help construct a better system, or even just sitting over coffee and having a chat with someone and getting them to grill you on, okay, what are the steps? And then in the conversational flow, you come up with stuff that you probably wouldn't with a bit of blank paper.
Those are fantastic ideas, Yusuf. Yeah. I mean, offer a free lesson in exchange. I'm sure your listeners give out free sessions all the time. Okay, the next one you do, say, look, I'd love to do a free session with you. Can we just record it so that I can share with other beginners what we do in a beginner lesson? I'm sure someone will take you up on that, right?
Yeah. Hey, excuse me, I'm just building a second brain. Do you mind having a free session with me?
Yeah, and then the other idea you had is great too. Have a friend or a colleague or another trainer who's willing, document it for you. They could just as simple as record it with their iPhone, or they can interview you. I really like that, right? Like interview you, like, okay, well, what do you do first? Okay, what do you do next? Well, why did you do it that way? Well, how about that? Almost like a demo first session. So then you're forced to be like, oh, well, we do it like that because of these obvious reasons. It's all going to be so obvious to you. You're going to be almost embarrassed to talk about it. But that is the stuff, I just thought of an example, a friend who's a facilitator. She did a YouTube video about how to write on Post-its. The little Post-it notes, how to write a Post-it. And you're like, what do you mean? That's obvious. But she had all these little tricks. She's like, you need this kind of Sharpie. Because if you use a normal pen, the letters are too thin and you won't be able to see it from a distance. But if you use a thick Sharpie, you won't have enough space to write. So it was like a fine point Sharpie, this specific model, right? And then she was like, when you go to rip off the Post-it from the pad, if you do it from the bottom and go up, the paper will be bent. It'll be too bent. And so when you stick it on the wall, it'll be like, instead of being flat, it will be up like this. So she showed how you have to pull it off from the side so that it doesn't get bent. Like, think about this stuff. Like, who would have even thought?
That is a woman who's written a lot of Post-its.
Right? Like, how many post-its has she written to discover some of these things? But I found it so helpful, and I use those tips to this day. Like, you can't underestimate how basic of support and instruction people need.
Yeah, and even from a bit of a weird example, but from a medico-legal perspective, in hospital, you will often have to deliver a piece of information to a patient or an instruction or a care plan or something. And every time, without fail, you'll get a patient sort of nodding at you and going, oh yeah, okay, cool. You're supposed to ask, can you just repeat back to me just to make sure that I've not missed anything? And there's always a disconnect in the
Yeah.
information that is fed back. And it's usually because there's stuff that to a physician is pretty obvious, but doesn't communicate or even skip those bits. So having that closing that loop is really important.